Hello, and welcome back to the Darkness Underneath podcast. This is episode 2 of the Bluebelle Murders, and it's titled On Cruel Waters. Now, I had originally only intended for this subject to be 2 episodes, but because of the amount of information I have and some footage, it's going to be 4 episodes. Anyway, let's begin. Okay, so where I last left you, this doctor, Terri Dupperault, saved up enough money in order to take his family on a vacation of a lifetime in the Bahamas on board a ketcher he rented called Bluebelle. And part of the deal was that in order to rent this ketcher, they had to have a captain named Julian Harvey. He was a former war hero, fighter pilot. He was paid to skipper the ship. Him and his wife. His wife would be, Mary, would be doing the cooking. Unfortunately, Julian Harvey was a murderer of wives. He had killed one wife already, and he had been planning on killing Mary, his new wife, because he was in debt and they weren't getting along, and dumping her overboard. However, something disturbed him, and I'll eventually get to what happened there in future episodes, and he went on a killing spree and mass murdered everybody on board the ketcher in order to leave no witnesses alive, except for a little girl named Terri Dupperault, who was about 11, 12 years old, and he sank her into the Atlantic Ocean in an area that is very deep. It's a trench called the Tongue of the Ocean. Anyway, who was Julian Harvey? Harvey had been fostering a larger-than-life image of himself for his entire life. When he was young and the house was on fire, he calmly escorted his mother and grandmother out without telling them what was happening so they wouldn't be scared, creating an image of himself as a gentleman and a hero. He was popular in high school, wealthy, well-groomed, and always working out. Although he originally struggled to get into the Air Force because of his eye, he had as you recall last episode, a lazy eye, he eventually enlisted and became an officer with an aeronautics degree. During World War II, Harvey flew a total of 29 combat missions with the 93rd Bomb Group. You can actually see his record online on the website for the British Museum, and you can see the B-24 he flew. After World War II, Harvey stayed with the Air Force and flew another 114 fighter missions when the Korean War came along. He was finally medically discharged from the Air Force in 1958 with the rank of major. Now, although Top Gun wouldn't be released for another 25 years, fighter pilots were already romanticized during the 1950s and 60s, and had he lived in the 80s, people would have probably associated him with Tom Cruise or one of the characters in that movie. This was a guy people associated with the word winner, somebody you'd want to hire, date, or otherwise be friends with. He was a kind of real-life John Wayne tough guy. An all-American patriot. He went to church regularly. His minister said that he always saw him there. And importantly, he was also known to be a bit of a stuntman. On September 20th, 1944, a NASA Langley researcher conducted a test to find out how much damage scuttling a B-24 into water would cause. Julian Harvey and his co-pilot conducted the test by ditching a B-24 into the James River. I have collected footage, which you're going to be seeing above if you're watching the footage part as well. And it shows you exactly how much damage was caused. It shows you the skills of Julian Harvey. You can see just how good a pilot he really was. And I want you to take notice because there's going to be a brief scene in which Julian Harvey exits the plane, the bomber, and the first thing he thinks to do as soon as he gets out is immediately he combs his hair and looks around in pose for the camera. this kind of behavior is common among narcissists, malignant narcissists. So you can see exactly how vain and egotistical he kind of was. That's not to say everybody is a narcissist who does that, but it's certainly symptomatic of them to constantly have to look to impress everybody around him. So it's easy to imagine Harvey would have done very well as a stunt double for Hollywood films. He certainly had a talent for crashing things and walking away unscathed. He was very talented as a driver, obviously as a pilot, as well as a captain of ships or boats, having crashed 2 yachts beforehand that he had owned, and once they became too expensive. And, well, as far as his John Wayne image goes, it wasn't entirely what he made it out to be, or on the surface what it seemed to be. He oftentimes abandoned his comrades during dogfights. He came under suspicion for this because he was having so much engine trouble that he ended up abandoning missions that by 1944 his superiors began to suspect that his nerves were shot. And of course, far worse, where he certainly wasn't a hero in any respect, was he was using his skills to commit fraud and murder and conceal his crimes. So underneath this persona was what forensic psychologists would call a malignant narcissist, and I'll get back to that more shortly. Now, one of the darkest fairy tales that there is about a serial killer named Bluebeard. Bluebeard is an aristocrat who, despite being ugly, attracts women with promises of a wealthy lifestyle, and then he murders them once they've disobeyed him or in some way made him unhappy. It became such a famous, or should I say infamous, fairy tale that the term Bluebeard came to mean a man who murders his wives. Now, it's kind of obvious that Harvey would have fallen into that definition. He was a Bluebeard. And that seems to have come out of some kind of pathological hatred of women. He saw them good for only 2 things, sex and money. He not only abused and discarded wife after wife, woman after woman, when he tired of them, he would take out life insurance policies, such as he did on 2 of them, and killed those 2. So while Harvey's responsible for his own behavior, if we want to understand where some of it might have originated, some of it is probably genetic, but some of it, obviously there was an element of that he was poorly influenced at some point. We look at Harvey's mom and his dad. Well, his dad didn't really have much of a role in Harvey's life. He left when he was very, very young. And Harvey's mom was always looking to date very wealthy men, such as his stepdad. Now, this was an era also where women were taught to look for men as providers, so there was that as well. But she was always dating wealthy men, and she looked towards this man as his stepdad as a provider, and who was very rich. And his stepdad came along and spoiled the hell out of Harvey. Bought him a boat, a yacht, when he was 10 years old. So already they're creating this, this kid who's kind of entitled, who gets whatever he wants. And then the Depression hit, and they lose their money, and they abandon Harvey, both his mom and stepdad, and leave him with his aunt and uncle. So he's going to be feeling the abandonment combined with this narcissistic being spoiled, this idea he's the center of the world, he's getting things other people aren't getting, other kids, most adults couldn't afford that. So that resentment probably started with her. He saw women as always looking out, for their financial interest. And, in the beginning, he wasn't a ladies' man when he was a teenager. He was skinny. He had to work out a lot. It's then that he, started attracting attention from the opposite sex. So He came to see the opposite sex as only interested in him physically and for his money, which he was always boasting that he had more than he actually did later on in life. So besides using his good looks and military record to attract women, Harvey was always showing off wealth that he didn't actually have and impulsively spending money that he didn't have to look like he had more money than he did, buying boats that he could not afford, and he went after would go after every attractive woman he could get, and he would go through woman after woman. He cheated, he was cold to them, so he really disliked them. They were just sex objects, and when he felt like they were using him for money or that they were disappointed because he didn't actually have the money he claimed he did, then he would resent that and want to use them back. So, what would Julian Harvey's psychological profile be? I have a master's in criminal justice and have done extensive research in forensic psychology, including speaking with doctors, and am very familiar with this subject. And my assessment is consistent with Dr. Richard Logan, who wrote the book Alone, Orphaned at Sea. He has a PhD in psychology from Harvard, and we both agree that Julian Harvey was a malignant narcissist. So, if you're not familiar with this term, what is a malignant narcissist? So when people talk about psychopath and sociopath, there's some debate about the meaning of those words, but they both fall under antisocial personality disorder. This is a condition characterized by a lack of empathy and regard for other people. They have little or no regard for right or wrong. They're often very insensitive and unfeeling, often engage in aggressive or violent behavior. Not all of them, but many of them do. Others, you might find white-collar criminals. Symptoms may include fire-setting, cruelty to animals, and difficulty with authority. Harvey certainly had difficulty with authority. We don't know if he set the fire when he was a kid and then escorted his parents out. There's just a lot we won't ever know about his childhood. They often have legal problems. I think that's a big yes with Harvey, resulting from failure to conform to social norms and a lack of concern for the right of others. That's a big one with Harvey. They often act out impulsively and fail to consider the consequences of their actions. Obviously, that's a big one with Harvey, from his marriages to his spending habits, which is common. Poor spending habits are common among antisocial personality disorders. Display aggressiveness and irritability that often lead to physical assaults. I think that's another big one that Harvey has. Have difficulty feeling empathy for others. Display lack of remorse for damaging behavior. Again, both Harvey. They have poor, abusive relationships with others. That's definitely Harvey too. Frequently lie and deceive others for personal gain. That's again Harvey. So, we know Harvey's an antisocial personality disorder. What a malignant narcissist is they are an antisocial personality disorder comorbid, that is, they possess both traits from both of these categories, with a narcissistic personality disorder. So, what is a narcissistic personality disorder? Okay, so a narcissistic personality disorder is somebody who has an inflated sense of their own importance, a deep need for excessive attention and admiration, troubled relationship, lack of empathy, and behind the extreme confidence lies a fragile self-esteem that's vulnerable to the slightest criticism. Malignant narcissist and antisocial personality disorders in general, they tend to be glibly charming. It's a superficial charm that helps them in attracting partners, but not on a deeper level. That's certainly something Julian Harvey had. and he would have reacted very, very aggressively when he felt as if these women didn't really love him or eventually rejected him. A few examples of the malignant narcissist would include Jim Jones, Charles Manson, and Ted Bundy. So that shows you just how dangerous these people can be. Now, let's get back to Terri's story. What happened to Terri that night that Julian Harvey left her to die? Terri Dupperault felt detached from herself as she stood in the darkness while water flooded the decks, swishing over her bare feet. The ketcher creaked, groaned, and teetered. There was the sharp smell of oil from the binges. She realized that Julian Harvey, for whatever reason, wasn't coming back to help her, and that there was something terribly wrong about him. But at that moment, she didn't have time to think about it, or her dead brother or mother, or whatever happened to her father and her sister. The Bluebelle was sinking fast, and Terri had to do something, or she was going to sink to the bottom of the Atlantic with it. The little girl remembered there was a tiny cork, a life raft used to keep people drowning afloat until help arrived. It wasn't made to keep people afloat for very long, but she was small, just a child, and she didn't exactly have many options here. It was attached on the outside above the main cabin, which was now mostly covered by seawater. Terri scrambled across the deck and found the cork. She untethered it and hauled it over the side, climbing down on top of it, not a moment too soon. The Bluebelle collapsed on its side and began to go down. A part of its mast snagged a line from the cork and began dragging Terri down with it into the depths. For a brief, nightmarish moment, it was then that she was pulled below the surface of the ocean into the cold, black wetness. That might have been the end of Terri. She might have vanished into oblivion over a mile below, but then, at that moment, luck happened and the ship let go. The Bluebelle quickly sank and vanished forever below, as Terri herself bobbed to the surface, choking, her clothing drenched with salt water. Terri held on to that tiny cork for dear life. She tried to remain quiet. It was very dark and cold. She remembered, though, that Julian Harvey was out there and that she couldn't afford to cry. He would come back looking for her, and he did, but he found her sister instead. It was at that moment that Terri felt most afraid. She knew that there was something very, very wrong with him. The night was cold and black under the cloudy sky. She lay on her cork, huddled against the webbing, wearing only a soaking thin blouse and pink pedal pushers. It briefly rained, lightly, exacerbating her coldness and causing her to shiver uncontrollably. Eventually the clouds dispersed and she could see a clear view of the stars. Millions and millions of them for miles and miles in the distance, making it almost seem like she was floating in space, a phantom in some cosmic dream. Dawn began to break. Julian Harvey was nowhere to be seen. He had taken the dinghy, along with her dead sister Renee, and jettisoned off to safety using the propulsion engine he had attached. But Julian Harvey wasn't the only thing out there. The Bahamas are full of life. Sea life was abundant all around her. It also lived in the darkness underneath her. Just a few days prior, her family had spotted a large shark sailing behind the boat. When asked what he would do with a rifle, Arthur joked, "Go shark hunting." Sharks are quite common in those waters. Hemingway set his story The Old Man and the Sea in the Bahamas, and one of its central conflicts involved a fisherman and sharks. And while they may not be the serial killers they are in Jaws, it would be foolish to dismiss the risk they can pose. The Bahamas are hunting ground for the four most dangerous species of shark: the tiger shark, the oceanic white tip, which were the culprits involved in the deaths of hundreds of sailors and the sinking of USS Indianapolis during World War II, the famous bull shark, one of the most aggressive, and, of course, the most feared of all, the great white. Just as I discussed this, actually, almost 60 years later, a girl was ripped apart by tiger sharks in the Bahamas just last year. Morning, they would have been able to see her bobbing up there. like a seal or potential prey. The more sharks she passed, the more likely one would be brazen enough to seize her dangling feet or knock her off the cork and drag her underneath where it would have torn her apart miles and miles from any help. It isn't clear why none attacked her, but Dr. Richard Logan's speculation sounds reasonable. Terri was still soaking with oil from the binges. Oil can be a deterrent for sharks, like a crucifix and a vampire. Could have masked her scent or caused them to stay away out of revulsion for the scent. But oil would only last so long, and eventually she would draw their attention. Looking around her during the day, for miles and miles, everywhere around her was endless and endless water, a total wasteland of ocean, ready to drown her if she should lose her cork or it should fail her. When she tried to sit up, the cork threatened to tip over, so she either had to lie in it, her rump covered with water, or hold onto the side, her feet dangling into the ocean below. She usually chose to lie on it to avoid the risk of a predator attacking her legs or the piercing bites of parrotfish. The sun's warmth was comforting at first, but as the day wore on, it grew hotter and hotter. Eventually, she felt like she was boiling as the sun scorched her, the air humid, reflecting off the ocean. There was no evidence of land anywhere other than the occasional bird flying overhead. She did see a ship or two, but they were too far distant, and sailed off, leaving her alone. By mid-Monday afternoon, on just the first day, the water in her skin was evaporating. She was thirsty, she was hungry, but of course there was nothing to drink or eat. In fact, to drink the ocean water, as some desperate people have, meant exacerbating dehydration and a horrible death. As it was, the salt water that dashed over her lips made her yearn for more water. Eventually, she began to feel heat exhaustion and dehydration, problems that were only going to get much worse. She drifted miles and miles into the Providence Channel. Monday night came. She dreamed of diving into the water and swimming home, but she woke up choking and sputtering water. She had almost crawled off her raft and drowned in the Black Sea, but her arm draped across the cork had alone saved her, allowing her to crawl back up. Later, she spotted a light, probably the Great Stirrup Cay Lighthouse, just miles away, but too far for her to swim. On the second and third day, she saw planes flying across the sky. Those planes were looking for her, not that she could know that. Julian Harvey had reached the Gulf Lion, and the U.S. and Bahama Coast Guard had been alerted. She waved at them, but they couldn't see her. She even removed part of her blouse and waved, but they still missed her. The white cork blended in with the white caps she rode. She might as well have been invisible. Although Terri remained optimistic and often prayed, she was getting delirious now, her fever worsening, her dreams becoming more vivid, and eventually the hallucinations came. It became difficult to tell reality from imagination. All she had wanted was a vacation with her family to the Bahamas. Her life had been a child's dream before this trip, but now her family was dead, although she still held out desperate hope somehow, some way her father had survived. Maybe he was alive, maybe he was out there looking for her, her hero. Perhaps he would save her. Among Terri's prayers was one that she wouldn't be alone anymore. Her body began to succumb to dehydration. It had already been several days, and she had lasted longer than many men would. Her hallucinations were only getting worse. At one point, she found herself taken away, flying off on board a plane. Then, at another, from the depths of a fever that was killing her, her father, Arthur Dupperault, visited her again. He was drinking a glass of wine. The liquid looked refreshing to her desperate, parched lips. Her father tilted his head and gazed at her peacefully. "Come on, Terri Jo! We're leaving now!" Finally, it was time to go home. Her father was here to take her away from this nightmare. Unfortunately, every dream must come to an end, and so too did hers, with a splash of cold Atlantic water. She awoke to ocean everywhere as far as she could see, once again. The day wore on. At some point along her journey, she saw birds flock to the ocean, feeding on some bits of fish that perhaps a barracuda or shark had left behind. She felt hope seeing the animals, but then they flew away. Dark shapes instead appeared below the surface, and at some point she felt rising terror that sharks had found her. But instead, bulbous heads appeared. They weren't sharks. They were whales. Pilot whales, though she didn't know what they were called then. She felt like they were sending her a message. We are life. You are not alone anymore, Terri. We're here with you. Terri felt exhilaration, smiling. They filled her with a sense of peace. At least one of her prayers was finally answered. She wasn't alone anymore, and there was still hope. If you enjoyed this episode, hit like and subscribe, and be here for episode 3 of Bluebelle Murders.